Welcome and thank you for joining today's Western EIM Governance Review Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require any technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will give you instructions on how to ask a question at that time. With that, I'll turn the call over to Bert Groth from the California ISO. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, this is Burton Gross, Deputy General Counsel at the California ISO. Welcome to everybody. I am going to do the roll call for the GRC members and then turn it over to Chair Hamp with the roll. Tony Braun, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Andy Campbell?
Here.
Suzanne Cooper?
Here.
Eric Eisenman?
Here.
Jennifer Gardner?
Here.
Therese Hampton?
Here.
Doug Howe?
Here.
Rob Taylor?
Here.
Rebecca Wagner?
Here.
Mary Winke?
Here.
Cameron Yurkowski?
Yeah, I'm here.
Let's see, Chris Raper? Commissioner Raper, are you there? If you are, if you're on mute, you may want to unmute. But
And if you're on the participant line, press pound 2 to raise your hand, and the event producer can open up your phone line.
okay, well, I'll move along for a moment and come back then. Is Val Fong here?
Here.
Angelina Galitova?
Present.
Okay, well, at this point, the only person who is not here, or at least hasn't indicated they're here, is Christine Raper. We do have a quorum, so I guess I'll turn it to Therese Hampton. Chair Hampton, do you want to proceed?
Yes, let's go ahead and proceed.
Okay.
We can go to the next slide. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining the Governance Review Committee meeting today. We've got the agenda here on the screen. We're going to start with just a little bit of administrative work and approve our general session minutes from October 28th and December 18th. And I'm going to turn it back to Bert for that process.
Okay, thank you. Since we have two sets of minutes, what I'm going to do is actually do them together at one time. So unless there's any objections or concerns around the minutes, what I will do is ask for a motion to approve the minutes and then a second. The two sets of minutes are the October 28, 2020 general session minutes and the December 18th, 2020 general session minutes. So if I could get from one of the voting members of the GRC a motion to approve.
Move to approve.
Okay, that was Suzanne Cooper. Is there a second?
This is Rob Taylor.
Mary, I can second. Oh, sorry, Rob. Mary, I can second.
I think Rob beat you out. Okay, well, now I'm going to just go through the voting members, so that does not include Val Fong or Angelina Galitova. Starting with Tony Braun.
Approve.
Andy Campbell.
Yes.
Suzanne Cooper.
Approve.
Eric Eisenman.
Yes.
Jennifer Garner.
Approve.
Therese Hampton.
Approve.
Doug Howe.
Approve.
Rob Taylor.
Approve.
Rebecca Wagner.
Approve.
Mary Winke.
Approve.
Cameron Yurkowski.
Approves.
And the only person left is Chris Raper. I'm not sure if she's come onto the phone line yet, but if you have, Chris, I'll call you as well.
Bert, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear?
Yeah, you can hear me now? I approve. I've been here since the beginning. I just did not have an open line. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, that's unanimous, so I'll turn it back to you, Therese.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll do a quick review of the agenda, and then we'll step into the substance of our meeting. You have the full Governance Review Committee here with us today, but I'll be joined specifically in the presentation by members Andy Campbell and Jennifer Gardner. So as we go through the agenda, we're going to start first. We've been in place, the GRC's been in place since December of 2019, and we thought it might be helpful to start with a reminder of the purpose and the background of the group, so we'll do a little bit of that. Then Andy Campbell will provide an overview of the comments we received on the revised straw proposal, and Jennifer Gardner will share the GRC's consideration of our next steps. And then I'll coordinate a discussion on all of this. We are very interested in your questions and comments on both the comments that we received and on our path forward. We are going to ask that you save your questions and comments until the end of the presentation, because we think we may answer some questions as we go along and we walk through kind of the considerations and what we think the next steps are. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk just a little bit about our background, the charter and the purpose for the GRC. So the charter for the GRC was finalized and jointly approved by the EIM governing body and the ISO Board of Governors in June of 2019. And we've noted a few of the major elements of the charter here on this slide. First, the charge is to develop proposed revisions to the EIM governance structure, and the governance documents require a review to be initiated no later than September of 2020. However, the transitional committee also contemplated a review if there was a significant increase in the size of the EIM footprint, and the rapid expansion of the EIM and other factors such as the contemplation of the extension of the day-ahead market to EIM entities prompted the review to be launched in 2019. So the charter also suggested that we may consider potential governance enhancements in the event a day-ahead market is added to the current EIM structure. In the revised straw proposal, we indicated that our proposal really applied to the EIM governance structure only, and then we would evaluate governance for any EDM market once an EDM market design was more fully formed. The other thing that we've noted here is the GRC is asked to strive for a consensus proposal that has the support of all members. There's an opportunity for majority and minority reports, but the objective is really to achieve a consensus proposal. And then lastly, all of our work will take the form of a final proposal that's provided to the EIM governing body and the ISO Board of Governors for their joint consideration. So some of the key takeaways, kind of, and part of the reason why we wanted to put this in here is our current focus is on the EIM governance and not on the EDM governance. That would be a future effort. We're working towards a proposal that has consensus from our GRC members and that ultimately it will be presented to the board. And if you go to the next slide, just a little bit of where we've been. So now that we know when we formed and what our purpose was, we issued a scoping paper in January of 2020, and we took comments on that, and we had a stakeholder workshop, and then we issued a straw proposal in July of 2020, and we took comments in that and had a stakeholder workshop. And then just last December, we had the revised straw proposal. We've taken comments on that, and then really that's where we are today. Andy Campbell's going to do a walkthrough of the comments, and then Jennifer will talk about our next steps. So I'll transition to Andy. If we go to the next slide.
All right, thanks, Therese. So again, I'm Andy Campbell. I'm with the Energy Institute at Haas at UC Berkeley. So the committee organized the governance topics we're considering under 6 headline issues. Issue 1 is Delegation of Authority. This contains several topics, all related to the relationship between the California ISO Board of Governors and the Energy Imbalance Market governing body, and how these bodies deliberate and make decisions. Issue 2 is how new members of the governing body are selected. Issue 3 addresses how the governing body engages with stakeholders and how stakeholders engage amongst themselves. Here we looked at the existing regional issues forum and the body of state regulators. Issue 4 includes 3 sets of topics. First, there's the annual policy initiative roadmap. Second, bundled together, the ISO's Department of Market Monitoring, the Market Surveillance Committee, and a proposal for a new governing body market expert. And then third, within this issue 4, is funding for technical assistance for the body of state regulators. Then issue 5 is a review of the governing body's mission statement, and issue 6 is other topics. Next slide, please. So we received 17 sets of comments on the revised straw proposal, and many of those comments were filed by consortiums of stakeholders. So these proposals have really been received a lot of scrutiny and input from stakeholders throughout the West. The committee is very grateful for the careful review and recommendations from stakeholders. So on the next 3 slides, I will briefly describe the input we have received on this latest proposal. So there are diverse opinions on the topics that fall under delegation of authority. Some support the GRC's recommendation to replace the current primary authority model with a joint authority approach. The joint authority model would have the ISO board and EIM governing body meet and deliberate in a single joint session, but vote as separate bodies on real-time market rule changes. Some stakeholders question whether changes are necessary for the EIM market and recommend revisiting this topic after more is known about the extended day-ahead market design. Then the GRC proposal and some stakeholders support defining joint authority to include all real-time market elements except those items related to ISO, grid, and balancing authority area reliable operations. Others propose different definitions or request that the GRC investigate the scope and implications of joint authority further. Next slide, please. So continuing with delegation of authority, we propose a process to resolve deadlocks between the ISO board and the EIM governing body. Some stakeholders support the proposal, which would provide for competing filings at FERC as a last resort in limited instances, and then others oppose this approach. The proposal discusses a dispute resolution process if the ISO board and EIM governing body disagree on whether a particular policy initiative should be subject to joint authority. Some stakeholders agree with the proposal's recommended approach that the board chair would break ties, and then others would like to see the tie-breaking role alternate between the chairs of the 2 bodies. And then the proposal recommends that if entities representing 85% of load outside of the ISO balancing authority area give notice of their intent to withdraw from the EIM, then the ISO board could withdraw the delegation of authority to the EIM without waiting for a notice period. Some stakeholders support this, and others recommend other triggers. So, in summary, the delegation of authority issues, we did receive diverse opinions, and we're going to be carefully considering these viewpoints. Next slide, please. And there was support or minimal comments on issues 2, 5, and 6. But on issue 3, we received some input. This was related to the engagement with stakeholders. So there's a recommendation from stakeholders to include a neighboring balancing authority area sector within the regional issues forum. The proposal kind of describes the different sectors that there would be going forward in the regional issues forum, and so there's a recommendation there be this particular sector included. And then next, the proposal recommends that the body of state regulators invite 2 liaisons from consumer-owned utilities on an ex officio basis. We received a recommendation that one of those liaisons should be specifically designated to be from a California consumer-owned utility. The proposal had not specified that. And then on issue 4, we received some recommendations. So one recommendation is that the governing body have access to a market expert sooner than contemplated in the proposal. And then others do not support the idea of a governing body market expert or recommend that it be funded entirely by entities outside of the California ISO. So again, we're carefully considering comments on issues 3 and 4 here. But I just say it's likely that overall we'll stay the course with our prior recommendations on issues 2 through 6. And so now I'll hand things off to GRC member Jennifer Gardner.
Great. Thank you, Andy. So, given sort of the wide variety of comments that we received, particularly on issue 1, the GRC wanted to kind of hit pause and figure out the best approach for moving forward. And so we considered several options for how best to move forward with the remainder of this stakeholder process. So the first option is to simply move forward with a final proposal now on all issues, so issues 1 through 6. The second option that we considered was more of a phased approach or a bifurcated approach. So with this approach, what we would do is we would move forward with a final proposal on issues 2 through 6, because as Andy alluded to in his comments, those were really the issues where we seem to have the most stakeholder consensus with slight areas of disagreement, but again, there was general consensus around most of those recommendations. And then for issue 1, which is of course joint authority and the related topics, we would save some time to further work out those issues and explore potential ways forward with stakeholders, have some additional time for stakeholder workshops to dive into those issues under issue 1, and have a final proposal on that set of issues by the end of the year. The third approach was to basically place everything on hold and move forward with all issues, so issues 1 through 6 on a slower time frame, and move forward with a draft final proposal by Q4, by the end of this year. So again, these were the three pathways forward that we considered. And if we could go to the next slide, I will go into a little bit more detail on some of the considerations we had as a GRC before we chose the path forward that we will be discussing with you today. So again, as you heard from Andy and as I have reiterated, there really seemed to be broad regional agreement on issues 2 through 6. There seemed to be some collective benefit to be gained from moving forward with implementing those recommendations on issues 2 through 6 in the near term. And of course, issue 1, the delegation of authority, the issue of joint authority topics, which as Andy discussed includes the process for resolving deadlocks, the decisional classification process and the dispute resolution for that process, and the process for rescinding joint authority. All of those topics under issue 1 really seemed to get the most varied opinions in this latest round of the stakeholder process, and seemed that there could be a benefit in potentially delaying that part of the stakeholder process to have more time to work through some of those questions and concerns with stakeholders. So a phased approach would provide us the opportunity, again, to move forward with those topics where there's general agreement and to spend more time through stakeholder workshops and other discussions on topics where that kind of agreement has not yet been reached. Finally, another consideration that we took into account was that CAISO and its management and staff, and of course many of the stakeholders in the regional space, are prioritizing summer 2021 readiness efforts, and we want to ensure that stakeholders have adequate time to really devote to these important governance issues. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So with all of those considerations in play, the GRC has decided, and we are recommending, that we move forward with the phased approach for handling the remainder of this governance process. So what is that going to look like? So we will plan on releasing a draft final proposal that we will call Part 1. And not to further confuse you, because you're going to have Part 1 and Part 2, and issues 1 and issues 2 through 6. So I'll try to be as clear as I can as I walk through this. But the draft final proposal, Part 1, would address issues 2 through 6 from the revised draw proposal. It would include previous recommendations and address stakeholder comments raised on those issues. Again, as Andy discussed, the most robust comments on issues 2 through 6 really focus on issues 3 and 4, and specifically the issue of sector representation on the Regional Issues Forum, and whether and when a governing body outside market expert should be hired for the governing body's benefit. So the GRC will submit a draft final proposal on Part 1 to the board and EIM governing body for their joint consideration in Q2 of this year. And then we would continue working with stakeholders to address comments raised in Issue 1 with tentative plans for a draft final proposal, Part 2, by Q4 of this year. So let's go to the next slide, please. For those of you who appreciate a nice visual, this is kind of how we're planning to bifurcate this process and what this looks like through the remainder of the year. Again, the draft final proposal we will release in Q2, and then that would go to both boards for their approval also in Q2. And then during the same time frame and through the remainder of this year, we will be working with stakeholders through stakeholder workshops to really dive into some of the concerns and some of the issues that have been highlighted on Issue 1, the joint authority model, and some of the sort of sub-issues underneath that, with the intention of releasing a draft final proposal Part 2 in November of this year, and hopefully getting this matter before both boards for their approval by the end of the year. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what does this approval process look like under a bifurcated stakeholder process for the governance review? So this draft final proposal Part 1, again, that's covering Issues 2 through 6, will be posted approximately 2 weeks prior to the GRC's next general session meeting. So at that general session meeting, we would be taking public comment, and at that time, we would be considering as a GRC whether we want to approve the proposal and submit that proposal to the board and the EIM governing body for their joint consideration. Something that I think is worth clarifying, because it might not be entirely clear from the outset, is that if we choose to approve the draft final proposal Part 1 as a GRC, it will go to the board and EIM governing body for their joint consideration. So they will be jointly approving, potentially, our recommendations. Now, if they approve those recommendations for Part 1, then we would end up in sort of a separate approval process before those changes could be reflected in the governing documents, including the EIM governing body's charter. So pursuant to the EIM governing body's charter, this is Section 8 of that charter, substantive changes to the charter must be approved by the Board of Governors, and those changes fall within the governing body's advisory authority. So again, there will be really 2 stages of the approval here. Both boards would approve the GRC's recommendation, or they would have the opportunity to approve the GRC's recommendations in Part 1. And then if they did, then we would enter sort of a second approval process where the EIM governing body, under its advisory authority, would decide whether they approve those changes. And if so, and the CAISO board approves them, then we would be able to make those changes to the governing documents. And again, this is all under Part 1, so Issues 2 through 6 only, and then we would save the rest of the year to prioritize Issue 1, the joint authority proposal. So with that, I will turn it over to our chair, Therese Hampton, to finish the presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So this last slide is just a summary of what the balance of the year looks like under this proposed approach. So as Jennifer just talked about, in March and April, we would publish, somewhere in this March-April timeframe, we would publish the draft final proposal on Issues 2 through 6. That's that Part 1. We would plan in April to have a vote on whether to approve and submit that draft final proposal Part 1 to the board and to the governing body for their joint consideration. In May, there would be a joint meeting to vote on the draft final proposal Part 1, and then June, we would have a GRC general session meeting to start framing the process for Part 2. This is going back now to the big delegation of authority issues and all of those. Simultaneous to that, there is work to translate the draft final proposal into governance documents, and so July is what's noted there, where the EIM governing body would have their advisory input to the board, and the board votes on changes to the governance documents for Part 1. September and October workshops on the delegation of authority issues is kind of what we have sketched out here. And then November, we would publish the draft final proposal for the remaining issues and look for a vote of the GRC in December. all of these dates are subject to change, so we may decide if we want to have more conversation about delegation of authority early or later. We want to be sensitive, as Jennifer mentioned, to the issues of summer 2021 readiness, so we want those to be able to take priority for stakeholders, and then we'll pursue conversation as it seems appropriate. That is all of our presentation. So at this point, we'd like to transition and take questions, hear comments, get your reactions to this. So this is an opportunity, if you have a question or a comment, #2, I think, on your phone to raise your hand, and we're happy to hear your thoughts about this.
You have a question in the queue. Let's go to the first caller. Your line is unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation.
Yeah, hi, this is David Towner with Northwest Requirements Utilities. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Great. Again, David Towner with Northwest Requirements Utilities, and I have a few comments on the proposal today from Northwest Requirements Utilities and the Public Power Council. Together, Northwest Requirements Utilities and the Public Power Council represent nearly all of Bonneville's preference customers. So, first of all, thanks to the GRC for their efforts to continue to explore creative solutions to these difficult issues. We understand the desire to spend additional time discussing the most challenging topics here, specifically issue 1. The GRC has identified improvements in EIM governance, and we think those should be implemented as quickly as possible. For example, every effort should be made to install an outside market expert in advance of next summer, so that that expert may conduct their own review if CAISO or neighboring BAAs, again, find themselves issuing energy emergency alerts. That said, it's difficult for stakeholders to assess this governance piecemeal. Issues surrounding the durability of governance structure were crucial importance to us, and we cannot assess the governance package until those issues are resolved. In regards to the proposed delay or the bifurcation, we're currently participating in Bonneville stakeholder discussions on the agency's potential EIM participation. In that process, we'll have to base our input into Bonneville's EIM participation on the governance package that has been approved at that time, and not on the potential improvements that may or may not be adopted in the future. And we'll also be assessing the proposed governance against other options, including the other organized market option in the West that has been offered by SPP. The proposal to bifurcate issues and delay decisions about the delegation of authority puts the most significant improvement identified by the GRC at risk of not being considered in our evaluation of Bonneville's participation in the EIM. So we urge the GRC to pursue changes in the delegation of authority as quickly as possible so that they may be considered in the discussions with Bonneville. And that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Zabin. Are there other comments or questions?
Yara, do we have anybody in the queue? Again, press #2 to raise your hand.
There are no further questions or comments in the queue.
Are there any additional comments that GRC members would like to make? Any kind of additional thoughts, things you want stakeholders to know?
Therese, this is Jennifer. If I might just respond to one thing that was just raised in the public comment.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. I just wanted to acknowledge, I think, what I was hearing there, which is, the frustration in delaying what I'm sure a number of stakeholders view as the most significant part of this governance stakeholder process, and that is the changes that are being considered under issue 1, which is the delegation of authority, and more specifically, the potential of moving to a joint authority model for EIM governance. I think that weighed heavily on the GRC when we were considering the appropriate pathways forward. And I can assure you that it is our goal here, and again, I'm speaking for myself, but I hope my fellow GRC members would agree with me, that our goal here is to resolve this issue and to spend additional time, not simply to delay a difficult task, but to allow all stakeholders to share their concerns and to work through this issue a little bit more thoroughly, because a number of stakeholders, I think, have raised valid concerns, and to fully address those, I think having these stakeholder workshops and really spending the time working through those issues will be critical. The closer we can get to consensus on this issue, I think the better for everybody. So again, I just wanted to address what I was hearing is some frustration with the bifurcation of this approach, and hopefully offering some assurance that it's our priority to resolve issue 1 and to not delay it for too long. So thank you, Therese, for the time.
Sure. Thanks for those comments. That's helpful. Okay, any other stakeholder comments or questions? Okay.
There are no further questions.
I think with that, we will call this meeting adjourned. The last slide, if you just want to go to the next slide, is just links to resources. So for those of you that want some additional helpful links, they are there in the slide presentation, and you all know who the Governance Review Committee members are, so if you have any thoughts you want to share with them, you can feel free to do that at any time. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we will look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.